Hello, my name is Brad Klausen. I've been a professional graphic designer and illustrator since I graduated from the University of Denver in 1998 with a BFA in graphic design. When I was 23, in the fall of 1999, I landed a job as the in-house graphic designer for the band Pearl Jam. I worked there for 8 years until 2008 when I decided to venture out on my own and form my own one-man design shop, where I focused solely on making concert posters for different bands like Pearl Jam and Queens of the Stone Age, Nine Inch Nails, Widespread Panic, Fish, Metallica, and many more. The title of my talk today is Examples of Neuroanatomy Found Throughout Art History and How It Relates to Consciousness. My job as a visual artist requires me to spend a lot of time in my mind's eye, in my imagination, listening to music and trying to see what vision or imagery the music evokes. These are some examples of the different posters I've done over the years. I've included these particular examples as you can see they deal with this idea of flashes of insight in the mind. Being a visual person my whole life, I'm fascinated by this aspect of mental imagery in the human brain, of fantasia, and with insight and epiphany, with the mystery of where ideas and insight and epiphanies come from. Having a job which requires me to come up with visual concepts and ideas and compositions, I'm often amazed at how ideas seem to appear, sometimes as if from out of nowhere, in my mind. However, I know they're not from out of nowhere. The ideas arrive obviously as the result of contemplation over days or weeks or months. I often say, revelation is the boon of contemplation. This ability humans have to have revelations I find beyond compelling. Now, keep in mind, I'm speaking about revelations of demonstrable truth. For example, the revelation of how to make fire, or create the wheel, or how to put airplanes in the sky, or come up with medical cures, or complex mathematical or quantum physics solutions. Human progress and success has just been one revelation of demonstrable truth after another. Think of the word discovery, to discover, to remove the cover of something, to reveal what was there all along but was hidden from view. I find this ability to tap into truth, to tap into ideas and bring them into the world and out of the realm of thought and contemplation, these aha moments where all of a sudden a person understands something in a way no one had previously and catapults the progress of society forward, to be, in my opinion, one of the most powerful aspects of the functionality of the human brain. My interest in this subject led me into our past to try and understand what our ancestors understood about consciousness and the brain, and trying to understand this notion found across time and civilizations with quote unquote seeing, or rather knowing. When we understand something, we say, oh, I see what you mean. Sight and seeing is synonymous with knowing and understanding and comprehension, not merely with basic visual functions. This idea of coming face to face with wisdom is a commonly reported feature of altered states of consciousness, of being in the presence of wisdom. It's found in psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, and mystical or ecstatic experiences. But it's also a common feature of normal states of consciousness, as most everyone has experienced in their life something resembling an epiphany, be it for something trivial or something profound. So my interest is in what our ancestors knew about how to incubate and induce revelatory visionary states, and how to extract truth and wisdom from these amplified or higher states of consciousness. I believe it can be shown that when we take a comparative holistic view of the artwork of humanity, we see that our ancestors understood the brain and consciousness far more than we give them credit. And they knew how to purify the physiology of the body, to purify the hormonal chemistry of the blood, and thereby the cerebral spinal fluid, in order to amplify and incubate these higher states of knowing. And most importantly, that they encoded this knowledge in their artwork, in the art of the architecture of their temples, in their sculptures, in their paintings, and within their literary art, such as religious scripture, mythology, poetry, and fable. I truly believe if we do not discard our ancestors by ignorantly labeling them as primitive, superstitious fools who created fantastical narratives to try and explain a world they did not understand, but rather that at least amongst those working in the arts and architecture, they had a high intellectual command of metaphor, symbol, and analogy, we could add tremendously to our understanding of the brain and consciousness by realizing what they knew about it and realizing that they chose to encode their knowledge in works of art and story rather than textbooks like we do now. In order to understand what they knew about it, we need to first look at their artwork, in which it appears they were depicting neuroanatomy. When I boil down and distill the essence of what my job is, of what graphic design is, at its base core, it's simply just the relationship between colors and shapes. The true essence of what graphic design is about layout or composition. the arrangement of forms. And that is where we need to start, looking at basic composition of shapes and forms. There was a precedent set within the medical community for accepting theories of neuroanatomy found within art history when the Journal for the American Medical Association published in their October 10th, 1990 issue, a paper by Dr. Frank Meshberger titled, An Interpretation of Michelangelo's Creation of Adam Based on Neuroanatomy. Meshberger presented the idea that in Michelangelo's famous painting, The Creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, that Michelangelo had depicted a human brain in the figures and forms surrounding God. Meshberger's theory is one that seems to be much more well-known and accepted now than it has been in the past. Here are two of the pages from Meshberger's paper. They are tough to see like this, but here we can see his outline showing the similarity in the composition of the shapes of God and the figures around him to the composition of a sagittal view of a human brain. Meshberger shows how you can see how God's left arm reaches back similar to the form of the corpus callosum, and how that hand reaches down towards the child, the same as the splenium does towards the cerebellum. In 2007, the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine published a paper in their December issue titled Brain Imaging in the Renaissance, by a team led by neurosurgeon Dr. Alessandro Paluzzi, neuroscientists Antonio Belli and Peter Bain, and radiologist Laura Viva, in which they corroborated Meshberger's interpretation of Michelangelo's depiction of a brain in the creation of Adam. Dr. Paluzzi and his team offered their take on what parts of the painting they believe are depicting particular parts of the brain, and I would disagree with their analysis on this on certain points. I believe Michelangelo was showing a far more detailed depiction of brain anatomy, and we can build on what Meshberger and Paluzzi and his team initially presented. There's not enough time to go over this, and these diagrams are smaller than they should be, but this is my take on what parts of the brain I think Michelangelo was depicting. I think had we been able to see the painting when it was newly finished, there'd be a great deal more anatomical correlations observable in the shadows and folds and coloration of things. Along with corroborating Meshberger's theory, Paluzzi and his team offered two other paintings from Renaissance artists in which they think the artists were depicting brain anatomy. One of the paintings, I'm not totally convinced that it's showing brain anatomy, but the other painting, this one by Flemish painter Gerard David, titled Transfiguration of Christ from 1520, very much seems to be showing a composition very similar to the shapes of brain anatomy, as Paluzzi and his team presented in this image above, showing the painting next to an MRI scan of a brain. The composition of the painting seems to be depicting the cerebrum and the ventricles, but also shows the figure of Christ representing the brainstem. And as I hope to show, we will see this common trait of the brainstem represented as a human form in other works of art stretching much further back in time than the Renaissance. As I was looking into this subject, I had to familiarize myself more and more with brain anatomy. Fortunately, in this internet age, we have this wonderful tool of online image libraries. Like anything, when you do an image search for brain anatomy, you get hit with seemingly endless walls of imagery, and you get everything from photos of actual brain anatomy, though I must admit, there's not nearly as much photographic imagery available online as one would expect. If anyone out there can direct me to some sort of database of photographic imagery of different parts of the brain, I would greatly appreciate it. So you have photos, you have plastic models, you have CGI, 3D rendered models and wireframes, to varying degrees of illustration. And it's here I want to address this aspect of the variety of ways in which people illustrate the same subject matter. Any person who's been to a drawing class knows each person in the class will have a varying image of the same subject matter compared to each other artist. 10 illustrators will generate 10 different images of the same subject matter, varying in style and technical ability. We see that here in these illustrations of the front of the brainstem. 8 different renderings of the same subject, yet while each drawing has different stylistic features or representations of the anatomy, the composition is basically the same throughout them all. And I bring this up to show how this is a common aspect of making art. It varies from each artist's hand and mind and ability to render what they are looking at. The more I looked at images of brain anatomy, the more I started to recognize familiar compositions and poses I had seen in my art history classes back in college. As I was scrolling through images of brain anatomy, I saw this plastic model of the brainstem. I immediately felt that the top portion of the thalamus and the ventricles, which I've marked in red, look like the nose or snout of an animal, the nose of a sheep or a rabbit. Since college, I have had this big book titled Encyclopedia Anatomicae, which is an encyclopedia of illustrations showing the musculature and skeletal anatomy of different animals. On the back cover of the book, there are some sample images. One is this image above of a sheep's nose and mouth. So I've seen it often when looking through the book over the years. I've had this book for over 20 years, and when I saw the top of that plastic model of the brainstem, it made me think of this drawing of a sheep's nose. It was the Y shape of the ventricles. If you draw a very basic cartoon rabbit face, you would draw a Y shape for the nose, then have these two curved shapes to represent the cheeks and the snout. Looking at this image of this model, I realized I had seen this composition before, this composition of a sheep's snout on top of a column. And I realized it reminded me of the ram sphinxes from the Temple of Amun in Karnak, Egypt. The walkway into the Temple of Amun is referred to as the Avenue of Sphinxes. As you approach the temple, you are flanked on both sides by a number of these ram sphinxes. These statues are usually identified as dating to the reign of Ramses II, who reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE, but it's possible they may date further back to Amenhotep III, who reigned from 1387 to 1350 BCE. The Temple of Amun is dedicated to the Egyptian god Amun, who is associated with the ram and is at times depicted as having a ram's head. The name Amun, A-M-U-N, is also seen as Amon, A-M-O-N, or A-M-M-O-N, or A-M-E-N, and means the hidden god. Even today, there is a part of the hippocampus that we refer to as Amun's horn, or the horn of Amun. This has been depicted on Greco-Roman era coins depicting humans wearing the horns of Amun, and the horns are depicted on the coins in compositionally the same place as the ram horn curve-shaped hippocampus is within the brain and the skull. We also see depictions of Zeus and his Roman equivalent, Jupiter, as Zeus Ammon and Jupiter Ammon, titles they were given because they were wearing the curved ram horns of Ammon. These observations about the hippocampus on these coins is already established information. It's not my own. However, I've yet to find the proper citation for who the first person was to present this idea. That being said, I can add to it that I think on the reverse side of some of the coins that show a plant called the Silphium plant, we may also see the brain. In the rendering of the flower at the top of the plant and the nerves in the spinal cord in the rendering of the stem and the branches of the plant. Here's a coin of Alexander the Great, who went to Egypt and was given the title, the son of Amun. So they minted some coins of him wearing his horns of Amun. This symbolism of rammed horns not only was showing the hippocampus, but was also related to divinity or kingship. When I placed the plastic model side by side with the ram sphinx, I was quite surprised to see how well the snout of the ram and the figure of the pharaoh between the paws of the ram sphinx seemed to match the composition of the model of the brainstem. Not only were the thalamus and the ventricles similar to the nose and snout of the ram, but there were correlations between the composition and shapes of the wrap legs of the pharaoh with the medulla oblongata, his torso with the pons, his face with the midbrain, his eyes with the mammillary bodies, the front of his headdress with the hypothalamus, and the classic Egyptian symbol of a raised cobra or a uraeus on his headdress with the infundibulum. Take note of the way that the pharaoh's elbows stick out at the sides over his legs. This mimics the lower half of the pons extending over the sides of the medulla. I have to take a quick second here to discuss composition and representative form. We all know the basic composition of a snowman: 3 circles, 2 eyes, a nose, a hat, and maybe some arms. And while we would all agree the composition of a snowman looks nothing like the composition of a human body, no one is made up of 3 circles or spheres, we all see that it is representative enough to give the impression of a person. A snowman is a highly simplified and distilled down composition of the aspects of the human form: a lower half, a middle half, and a head and some eyes. When we look at the brainstem, we see a similar simplified, distilled down composition of a human form. It does not look exactly like a human being, just as a snowman does not look exactly like a human being, but the basic compositional building blocks are there: legs, a torso, a face, eyes, and even a hat. When we look at certain illustrations of the brainstem, this simplified human form composition is a little more obvious than, say, that plastic model. In illustrations like this one, you even see what would correspond to a mouth on a human composition in the posterior perforated substance, here. But mostly I'm going to show in this illustration is the infundibulum, marked in orange, where it sits above the mammillary bodies, or what would be the eyes of our simplified human form. When you compare the ram sphinx to our more modern illustrations of brainstems, you start to see a similar composition of shapes. And look how the infundibulum sits in the same spot as the uraeus on the pharaoh's headdress. And see how we have a very similar compositional arrangement of shapes from the human form of the pharaoh under the ram to the anatomy of the brainstem. Not only is the nose of the ram sphinx similar to the thalamus and the ventricles, but the entire ram head and horns is very similar in shape and form to the cerebrum. In both these photos of brains, we really see not just the ram shape of the cerebrum, but we see that same Y shape of the ventricles and the snout of the ram. Which takes us back to Dr. Paluzzi's 2007 Society of Royal Medicine paper, comparing Gerard David's transfiguration of Christ with an MRI scan of the brain. When we look at the ram sphinx next to David's painting and the MRI scan, not only do we see very similar composition of shapes in the cerebrum, but we see this use of a human form representing the brainstem in the pharaoh of the ram sphinx and the figure of Christ in David's 1520 painting. As I continued looking through images of brain anatomy, I saw this plastic or CGI model of the brainstem, and I instantly recognized this pose and this composition. The compositions of shapes and the pose of this brainstem model instantly made me think back to the enigmatic statues of Artemis or Diana of Ephesus. These statues are famous for their bizarre composition of a human form with tubular legs, covered in animals, and having these multiple breasts. This particular brainstem model seemed like it had small hands sticking out at the side, which is what made me think of the pose of these Artemis statues. These little hands, I would learn, are the trigeminal nerves. When we look at these Artemis statues, we see a more decorative rendering of the same basic composition of the pharaoh of the ram sphinxes: tubular legs, a bulbous torso, a face, and a crown. But unlike the pharaoh, who had his hands and arms facing inwards towards his stomach, these Artemis statues have their arms opening outward, similar to the way that the trigeminal nerves come out of the pons. There are varying renditions of this style of multi-breasted, wrapped leg, animal-covered statues. The more I looked for images of the trigeminal nerves, the more I saw just how much they look like hands and arms reaching out, as in this CGI illustration of the brainstem and the trigeminal nerves. Take note of the crown of this Artemis that I've illustrated here. The window in the castle on the crown in orange is once again in the same space as the infundibulum on the brainstem. However, in this model of the brainstem, we're seeing the pituitary gland, but the pituitary gland is in line with the infundibulum. Another thing I found very compelling with all these Artemis Diana statues was they all seem to have this framing or partition around the sides of their head, as you see on all four of them up here. Looking at the brainstem model, the brainstem seems to have this same framing in the cerebral crust, colored in the muddy olive green color. And in this model, this rendering of the brainstem, the shape of the cerebral crust very much reminded me of the traditional shape of the Egyptian headdress. And we see in both the ram sphinxes of Karnak and the Artemis statues, they both have this shape framing the face or head. And we also see this same composition of framing the face in the halo around Christ's head in Gerard David's painting. I then saw this simple illustration of the brainstem, but drawn from a somewhat of a lower perspective, looking more upwards. And once again, I recognize this pose as being compositionally similar to other works of art. The way the trigeminal nerves were depicted reminded me of the pose of these depictions of the Mesopotamian goddess of Ishtar. Their raised up arms and hands seem to be very similar to this illustration of the brainstem. And in both renderings of Ishtar, she has sort of a pointy crown on the top of her head, which is referred to as the tiara of divinity. In this illustration of the brainstem, its more upward-looking perspective makes the optic chiasm and the hypothalamus appear to be similar in form to this tiara of divinity, here in green. In the Burney relief, we even see how her tiara is sort of more rounded, similar to the way that the optic chiasm is depicted. Then I saw this illustration showing the back or the dorsal side of the brainstem, and once again started to recognize a familiar composition of form. It looked like this famous statue of Ishtar. There are other versions of this pose of Ishtar holding her breast, which is referred to as the Ishtar pose. The shape of the back of the brainstem seemed to me seemed to me to be doing the Ishtar pose and very much reminded me of the shape of the overly bulbous thighs and shoulders of the Ishtar statue. If you look at the brainstem, the way the pineal gland sits just above the two superior colliculi, it's similar in composition to how Ishtar's necklace sits just above her breasts. Her breasts seem to be representing the superior colliculi, her hands the inferior colliculi, and her arms represented are the brachium and the medial geniculate body, and her shoulders the pulvinar of the thalamus. The way the cerebral peduncles flare out and attach to the cerebellum, here in red, very much look to me like these oversized thighs on Ishtar. We will see in other examples this idea of how showing the peduncles as large thighs or buttocks on a basic female form. This Ishtar statue also has a bizarre carved out segment on her stomach shown here in blue. I think this is showing us the gap between the peduncles and the brainstem. Then things got very interesting. When I saw this wireframe model of the brainstem, the way the pons and the thalamus was rendered immediately made me think of the first work of art you learn about in art history class, the Venus of Willendorf. Compositionally, these two images seemed very similar to me. Even the way the bottom of the pons is rendered in the wireframe model seems to match and be similar to the way that the bottom of the belly of the Venus is rendered. The Venus of Willendorf has these disproportionately thin and long arms resting on top of her breasts. And the arms seem to me to match, the arms don't seem to match her fatter and squattier frame. They're thin and they don't seem to fit her. So I feel like, in my opinion, what we're seeing again could possibly be these trigeminal nerves. I saw this photo of a brainstem with a pituitary tumor. And while I do not think the head of the Willendorf Venus is representative of a pituitary tumor, the composition of the shape of the pons and the medulla seems similar to the composition of the Venus. And with that somewhat circular pituitary tumor up here, it helped me see a similarity in the composition of the Venus to the brainstem. There have been numerous Venus figurines found throughout Europe and Russia. This is the Hohlefels Venus found in Germany, which dates back to the Upper Paleolithic era. Having been looking at image after image of different renderings of brainstems, I started to see a brainstem in the Hohlefels Venus. In particular, it was the horizontal stripes on what would be the belly of the Venus. They looked exactly like how artists illustrate the pons with horizontal striping or banding that is seen on the pons. The horizontal dark line between the belly and the lower half of this Venus look to be very similar to the same dark line between the pons and the medulla in the photograph here. The Hohlefels Venus is very small. It's only 2.4 to 2.5 inches tall. The human brainstem is around 3 inches tall, so they're similar in size. When you look at the side profile of the Hohlefels Venus, the angle or pitch it has seems to me to be very similar to the angle or pitch of the brainstem in the skull. When we look at other Venus figurines in side profile, we see they seem to share a somewhat similar composition as the brainstem. In particular, it was the way the heads of some of these Venus figurines stick out or jut out over the neck. To me, it looks like the same shape or composition to the way the thalamus seems to protrude forward over the pons and the midbrain. And in some of the Venuses, the space or the gap between the bottom of the chin and the top of the breast seem to be the same as the gap from the bottom of the thalamus to the top of the pons. This is the Venus of Lespugue found in France. While I believe the front of this Venus is once again showing us the medulla and the legs and the pons and the torso and breasts, it is the lines on the back of the legs of the Venus I find interesting, and that it seems to be showing us the same lines on the back of the brainstem. The common theory for these lines is that they are depicting the lines of a skirt, but I'm not sold on this theory, as the lines are not depicted on the front of the legs as well, only on the back. And again, we are seeing these oversized hips and buttocks, like in the Ishtar statue and other Venus figurines, which I believe is not a symbol representing fertility in regards to childbearing, but is representative of the cerebral peduncles. Now, that is the end of the presentation of those images, and there's a lot more to unpack and explain in regards to how this all relates to consciousness and states of knowing. But seeing these works of art showing compositions similar to the composition of the brain and the brainstem made me understand how our ancestors were creating didactic art, using art as teaching tools, using analogy and symbol as teaching tool. It also made me understand that our ancestors knew far more about the brain and consciousness than we think they did. My interest here is not history, nor anthropology, nor evolution. My main interest is trying to take a comparative look at what all civilizations of humanity have possibly known about consciousness. What have we collectively as a species known about consciousness? I don't care about when it was known, where it was known, or who it was known by. Many, when viewing this work, will say that there is no way our ancestors knew about this or that aspect of the brain at such and such time period. And I would offer that perhaps their artwork suggests otherwise. And we need to reevaluate our ideas on what we think they did not understand. It seems to me that the mystery and marvel that is consciousness has been on the minds of man since the mind has been on man. Thank you very much for taking time to watch this presentation.